in which an unimaginable Chapter 11, in which an unimaginable terrible thing occurs. The thought form, a thing of malice, advanced through the cold gloom of the attic towards Sister Tharp. It was like a dull, dying sun that had risen alone in a dark sky. Everything began to shake. The attic was shaking. The upper floors of the maze undue were shaking. Dust was swirling. Pegs were rattling loose. Tiles were dropped out of the roof and smashing on the shivering floorboards. Everywhere there was a cracking and groaning and screeching of wood. The fierce, bloodshot light kept moving steadfast. I shrank back from it. The light was burning hot, but the attic was brutally cold. A winter wind was suddenly invading through every crack and slot. I heard the thought form speak to her again, its mind voice jarring my unprotected brain.
"What are you? What has sent you?"
Sister Tharp recoiled from it. Her face could not hide her consternation. She twisted her hands and the silver kine blades whipped at the red shadow, but they could do no damage.
"Patience, patience, patience."
The non-vocal words etched into our thoughts like acid. I stumbled back and tried to find Judica, but I could not take my eyes off the demonic light.
"He should not have sent you to us. He is a fool, and he will grieve over his error. Tell him Grail Margent found his spy and ended her."
The bloodshot light struck. The force of its telekinetic fury burst the ancient house's ailing roof, flinging slates into the air from the initial point of impact, and then ripping along the ridgeline, peeling the entire roof back from the rafters. This rippling, travelling force threw thousands of loose tiles into the night wind like dry leaves. The attic section we occupied was suddenly opened to the air, and shredded sheets of tiles were blowing off into the sky, like sloughed snakeskin. The rafters themselves, along with the ridge beam, the purlins and the trusses, splintered and cracked, or burned away like fish bones in a fire. As the section of roof tore away, I was fully exposed to the fierce, cold wind that had been trying to get in since the thought form appeared. I realized quite how precariously high up the top of the Maison Dieu was, perched on the seat of Highgate Hill, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city. We were at the summit of the sky, with faraway stars below us. With the wind came rain, torrential rain, which I had not been aware was falling. The driving rain drenched us in the open attic, wetting down the dust. A terrible storm had, that night, dropped across the city of Queen Mab, blotting out the stars and sending down a deluge. But the battle inside the Maison Dieu had quite distracted us from the elemental changes without. I wondered then, as I wonder now, if the thought form hadn't brought the storm with it. I clung to a broken spar of sidepost and hoped the wind would not pluck me out of the attic and cast me away over the city like a piece of slate. The rain was in my face, and the wind was pulling my hair. I screamed Judica's name. I screamed out Sister Tharp's name, too. She fled back along the attic, dodging between beams and under rafters as they were wrenched away. The pitched roof drew aside, like a blanket or ground sheet lifted up and shaken so as to find a mouse beneath it. The further she ran, the further the roof peeled back to expose her, denying her even the slightest refuge or shelter. Purlins and beams that had been in place for many centuries tumbled away into the sky like matchsticks. She was brave. In the face of the bloodshot thought form thing, she was very brave indeed. The possibilities of flight exhausted, she turned to meet her nemesis. She deployed her formidable telekinetics against us. The concussion of their mines knocked me down and clouted my ears. Several old chimney stacks and part of an outside wall perished, dumping tons of friable stone and brick down through the maison Dieu, through lower roofs, through corridors and rooms. Something grabbed me. I looked around, prepared to fight almost anything off, but saw Mentor Sauer. He had a gun in one hand, a large las pistol, and his other hand had clamped me by the arm. He had a look on his face that one might expect to see worn at a funeral or a deathbed vigil.
Get below.
He yelled at me over the wind and rain and the sounds of the building's fabric shedding. "Something must be done, Mentor!" I cried.
It is being done,
he yelled back, shoving me towards the attic steps.
Hajara!
For all I would obey him, obey his words and his urgings, I balked and looked back in surprise.
Hajara!
He repeated. A code word. One of the school's simple key commands. Surely even for this, I started to say.
Not for this. For them,
he said. Mentor Sauer shook me and turned me to look at the sky. Lights were approaching out of the storm. They looked like blue-white stars, rolling down the slope of the sky towards us. But I realized they were the powerful sweep lights of flying machines. Black shapes, like carrion birds, were wheeling through the sky towards the high house. I could already hear the coarse song of their lifter engines. A raid? I asked. That woman was just the scout. Who are our enemies that we—
Go, you little idiot!
Sauer bellowed at me.
Hajara!
I ran down the steps, down the old wooden stairs into the trembling house. Wind and rain followed me. The wind was slamming at every shutter and window, and the maison Dieu was shaking from the tumult of the conflict underway above. I was shaking. If the maison Dieu had not been in violent tremor, I would nevertheless have been unable to hold my hands steady. I had forgotten my hurts and pains, my minor injuries. All was eclipsed by the shock of the terrible thing that was happening to us, to the school, to our home. Hajara. An antique word saved from the old desert languages of terror. Dissolution, flight, dispersal, the scattering of a community. We had been trained in the understanding that if the order were ever given, we would know precisely what to do without any further instruction, and never question the command. We had been raised in the expectation that it would never have to be given. I ran down towards my room and took from the hook on the back of the door a leather satchel that hung there. A bag pre-packed with essentials, and always ready. There was no time to look around or say goodbye. No time to even consider taking other possessions. I emerged from my room and met Pariah coming from hers. She had her own satchel. She was clenching her jaw to fight back the tears in her eyes. She looked at me. We embraced quickly. Then she turned and started to run without looking back. I moved my own way. I had decided to descend and take the west door out through the skirts into Highgate. I passed two of the youngest children on the stairs. They were so intent on flight they did not even once look at me. From above came more crashes and loud noises. Outside, the roar of the flying machines closing in exceeded the raging gale. Sweep lights flashed along the landing, peering in through old windows with blinding beams. I ran the length of the landing anyway, daring the lights to find me. One of the landing's 5 large windows exploded in at me. Pieces of glass flew, pieces of frame. I jumped back and shielded my face. Something had struck the window outside and smashed it in out of its old frame. I looked out. Into the wind. Into the rain. Directly below me, Sister Tharp clung to the fractured sill. Some force, I could barely imagine, had thrown her off the rooftop, but she had struck the side of the building on the way down and arrested her plunge. I saw how she had done it. Her right hand was clamped around one of her silver pins, which was stabbed into the wooden sill like a climbing spike. She was cut and bleeding. Her hair was plastered to her face by the rain and by blood. Her clothing was torn. She clung on by her hands and perhaps by the force of her mind. But her feet were swinging above a sheer drop of 10 stories down into the lower, jumbled skirts of the school building. The rain-flecked night yawned below her, and fragments of debris, glass and wood, from the window she had destroyed tumbled away past her into the abyss. She looked up at me. Her eyes were green. She was not afraid, but she was certain of her own predicament. "Why?" I asked. "Why have you done this to us? Are you so avowedly our foes?" "Help me," she gasped. "Help you? You have destroyed everything!" I cried. My anger for her was consuming. "It had to be destroyed," she struggled. "You have no idea. It had to be destroyed." Her hands were slipping on the broken wet wood, and the silver pin, which was slightly bent. She was weak and hurt, and the strain was overwhelming. I felt her mind pulling at me, trying to find purchase, trying to take hold of my hands and forearms. I took hold of my cuff and switched it dead. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Her grip was gone. All the force of her mind was sapped, and only her fingertips arrested her descent. It was not enough. She fell away, backwards into the blackness and the rain, her arms and legs flailing. The drop was very far. I did not see her land, nor did I want to. Chapter 12. Undue, Undone. I took the silver pin out of the wood. It was a serviceable weapon where no others were available. I descended into the skirts of the Maison Dieu, throwing myself down one dark staircase after another. Through open doors I saw furniture knocked over and possessions left behind by other members of the school on their evacuation. The engines of the circling flying machines made the loudest sounds of all. Sweep lights stabbed in at windows as they passed. I was certain that these were gunship flyers, military craft hired or stolen for the purpose. There was such single-minded malevolence behind this attack. Would the gunship shortly commence firing on the school? Would they demolish the place, stone by stone, with their radial guns and cannon batteries? I heard other sounds. The battering and stoving in of doors, the kicking of shutters. Men, the agents of our faceless enemy, were storming the school. Perhaps this was to my advantage, I thought. The gunships would not risk firing on a structure occupied by its allies. Men I could deal with. Gunships I could not. I thought of the woman I had killed, or at least consigned to a certain death. It gave me pause, but I did not feel sick over it. They had made themselves our enemies, and they had revealed their animus. War had been declared, and we were just defending ourselves, in the name of the Emperor, who is our guide and master. In the name of the Holy Inquisition, we had unimpeachable justification for our actions. What justification did these heretics have for theirs? I swung my satchel over my shoulder and made for the west door. Raud appeared, out of nowhere. He had his satchel and also a gun, which he had procured from I don't know where. Young, frightened, he aimed it at me until he saw who I was. "Ajara," he said. "I know," I said. "They are devils," he said, "and they are everywhere." "Just get out," I told him. "You don't need the gun. Just get out, go to ground." Raud was gangly, in the midst of a major growth spurt, and his skin was poor. He looked like a youth waving a toy gun. Except the gun was real. A door behind him was flung open. It was all but taken off its hinges by the manual ram tool that had splintered the lock. 2 men came in, one of them casting aside the hefty ram bar. They were dressed in dark clothes and were wet with rain. They had dark glasses with small round lenses and ballistic jack shirts. "Lie down on the floor!" one shouted. Raud shot him. Raud was a good shot. It was an area in which he was fast excelling. He put 4 rounds into the face and neck of the man who had issued the order and sent him slamming back into the kicked-open doors. The man's round dark glasses, the lenses smashed, flew into the air as he fell. The other man drew a las pistol. He started yelling commands into a Vox headset and fired at us. A las round blew apart the door jamb beside me, making me yelp and flinch. I looked at Raud. He seemed very calm. "Please run, Beta," he said cheerfully. "Run the other way." 2 more shots came at us. Raud turned back to return fire. Only then did I see the small hole in his back, the size of a fingertip. Smoke curled from it. A las round had passed clean through him. He fired at the man who had shot him, sinking very slowly to his knees as he did so. I ran. There was nothing I could do for him. But there was one last thing he could do for me. I dodged left, into a sub-hall, and then through the drill into the storage area that adjoined the south door. But that area had been stormed too. I came up short the moment I saw the big old doors, splintered flat on the floor, where some exterior power had smashed them. I turned right instead, and made my escape through the cold, dank rooms of the old basement kitchens. In doing so, I ran straight into the intruder who had smashed in through the south door. He was not a man. He was an it. And it was a box. A great metal box, partly like a throne and partly like an iron casket. The box hovered above the floor, held up by gravitic mechanisms. It had moved so silently, I had literally run into it and half fallen across its sloped front. The metal was warm. I leapt back, aghast and afraid. I did not know what it was except that it was another agency of our enemy and evidently some armoured device for storming a building. Except I could feel that it was looking at me. Recessed devices in its bulky armoured integument were perhaps picta lenses or scanning nodes, or perhaps the cones of sensor pods. And perhaps it was more than that. Something more powerful than the most sophisticated human technology. But if there was any Psychana force inside that box, it was helpless. My cuff was dead. My raw pariah field was blunting the world around me. I would not let this thing take me alive. Chapter 13, which concerns the search for sanctuary. I stepped back from the coffin throne. Its systems hummed, keeping its vast weight improbably off the stone floor. It had an intimidating presence. It made me think of sarcophagi, of the gilded tomb boxes in which the tribes of the Crimson Desert had once buried their dead chieftains. Mentor Malise had shown me pics of these venerable objects, recovered by antiquarian explorers from long barrows and cylinder vaults out in the dune ocean. The exteriors of the sarcophagi were fashioned in the likenesses of their occupants. A king famous for his hawk nose, a queen beloved for her heartless smile, a prince renowned for his fierce brow and piercing stare. The prince in this dull, rusting box had been defaced. There was no exterior likeness, or no face to make a likeness from. He was also crippled, and could not rise to his feet from his throne. This thought, more than any, troubled me. I knew of only one mighty lord who could never again rise from his golden throne, but whose power saw all, and was all. For a moment, I blushed to admit it, I actually wondered if this was a visitation, if I had been singled out to bear witness to some prophetic annunciation of the God Emperor above us all. Then, of course, I recognized the foolishness of this imagining, the arrogance of it. I was one of a trillion souls within the imperium of mankind, and to be singled out was in all ways beyond ridiculous. By no conceivable measure was I of any consequence, not even as a promising pupil in an Ordo training facility. No. The coffin chair was a mindless instrument for smashing open doors and storming buildings. It was a siege engine for close combat urban work. It said something. A blurt of voice noise from hidden speakers. I ignored this. The coffin throne seemed helpless, and I presumed gratefully that its psionic drivers had seized up because of my unlimited blankness. I heard it chatter again, sending and receiving vox signals. There was someone inside it, a servitor at least. It couldn't tackle me, but it was reporting my position. I ran again, back the way I had come. Our enemies had surveyed the Maison Dieu well. They had every opening and exit covered. All the principal ones, anyway. But the Maison Dieu, old and rambling, was a maze, after all. And only one who had lived within its walls for years, and had explored its extremities with a child's curiosity, could know all its secret ways. I ran. Behind me I heard the ominous coffin throne purr forwards in pursuit. I turned back through the old basement kitchens, with their dry, lime-scaled sinks and dust-caked work surfaces. Old pots and pans hung from ceiling rails, pots that had never been used in my lifetime. I did not run all the way back through the kitchens, though. I turned left, into a root store that should have been a dead end. The store had a narrow door, which led to a steep and single descending flight of steps. The coffin chair simply could not fit to follow me. Below, in the doorless, windowless store, I pulled aside a heap of mildewed sacking and an old section of panelling, ignoring the wretched soil grubs and beetles I disturbed. Here was a space. A cavity all the youngsters at the Maison Dieu eventually learned about, if they explored enough. If I bent right down, I could scurry along a little tunnel of dank brick in the dark, pass under part of the south wall, and come out in a section of the skirts we all knew as the stables. There was a street door there, an unremarkable entrance that led down into a corner of low Highgate Lane. Perhaps this had not been discovered yet. I was now very low down in the structure of the Maison Dieu, deep in its abandoned basements. Still, I could hear from high above the whine of the menacing gunships hovering at our eaves, and the thump and crash of intruders. Twice, I heard exchanges of gunfire that made my heart go cold. Who was fighting? Who was so cornered that they could not simply flee? Who was dying? The so-called stables were as I remembered them, though I had not been down into their dingy cells for years. We called them the stables for no other reason than in the drab stone chambers there were traces on the walls and floor, where wooden partitions which had divided the place into stalls had once been fixed. To the walls were screwed iron baskets into which feed could be deposited. I came through into the grey twilight of the stables, in the hope of reaching the lane door, but realised at once that the space could only be a grey twilight if the lane door was already open, allowing light to fall in. I kept to the walls, my satchel across my back, the bent silver pin in my hand like a knife. 3 men had come in off the lane, having forced the door. I watched, and saw it was in fact 2 men and a woman. They were dressed like the intruders I had encountered with poor Raud. Their dark clothes were topped with ballistic jack-shirts, and they wore round-lensed dark glasses. They carried heavy flashlight instruments, but the devices gave off no luminosity, though they were pointing them into every corner and alcove as they searched. I knew they were mercury vapor lamps, shining with an incandescence beyond the regular visible range. The lenses of their dark glasses allowed them to see whatever their lamps illuminated. The intruders were seeing the world as a cold, electric blue place. I had to get past them. All 3 of them. The lane door was so close. I waited. One came near, One of the men. I pulled in against a doorway as he came through it, shining his invisible light ahead of him. I held the silver needle down at my side, the spike of it projecting beyond the pad of my palm. With a brisk jerk, I stabbed it into the meat of his thigh at the base of his buttock, below the hem of his bodyjack shirt. He cried out in pain. I felt his blood, hot as caffeine from a stovepot, spurt across my hand as I plucked the needle out. His leg folded under him, requiring him to fall down. I was already moving, putting my force into a high rotational kick. Hurt, surprised, and falling over a leg that no longer functioned, he made no defense. My kick connected, turned his face sideways and cracked his head against the wall behind him. He bounced off this impact and fell flat on his face. The female was right behind him. I snatched up the mercury vapor lamp the man had dropped and aimed it in her face. She squealed and leapt back, temporarily blinded. As she reeled, I hit her in the side of her head with the lamp and put her on the floor. I wanted to run for the lane door, but the third man was in the passage between me and it. He had heard the commotion and was turning to charge at me. I ran back into the Maze Undue, away from the street. The man sprinted after me. The woman got up and came after him. My headlong flight was not so counterintuitive. They hadn't cornered me or driven me backwards towards others of their kind. My choice of direction had been deliberate. 10 yards down the stable hallway, I passed through a stone archway. My pursuers close behind me reached the archway, then flew both off their feet, as though they had run into a wire. They slammed onto their backs, twitching and gurgling. My cuff had cancelled the effects of the pain door, built into the archway. They had run directly into its field. I did not wait. I turned back, picked my way quickly between their spasming bodies and ran down to the open street door and the grey light beyond. The rain was still falling, very hard. I stepped into Low Highgate Lane and smelled the cold, damp air, the wet stone, and the trash and soot of the city. The whole city had been my classroom. Now Queen Mab would become my hiding place. Chapter 14.